If I may be permitted to conclude with a sort of a return, with a question about public perceptions of the Stalin period.
Mm-hmm.
For all that the profession has developed and gone through these stages decade by decade, there does seem to be an extraordinarily sort of enduring sense of public sense of the regime in very much totalitarian terms, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
How do you explain that?
It's very strange that the profession, it was really strange how the profession accepts, basically, in my sense anyway, they accept the revisionist stuff, but the broader public is virtually totally unaffected by it and continues to be interested in Stalinism the same way they're interested in Nazism. You know, it's the great the great evils that's nothing that the revisionists did or that the post-revisionists did has changed that. And I'm not, I mean, exactly why that is, I don't know. I think the revisionists certainly did not address themselves to the broad public, probably feeling the broad public, especially in America, was not going to like what they wrote. And, you know, things were bad enough in Cold War terms within academia, let alone outside. But why? I mean, have you got a sense of why? I don't know how to explain the perpetuation of that.
Well, it's always struck me that there is a comfort in the moral simplicity of identifying the individual or that small group that is responsible for all the awful things that happen in that period. And when you present explanations that identify sort of a much more diffuse responsibility for, you know, what appear to be extraordinary crimes, it becomes very complex, morally complex, difficult to explain in a compelling and simple way. It's much harder to present to the public. And
of course now we have also the post-Soviet Russian contribution to this, where I think the Russians have, after all, a big stake in, and they perceive it very strongly. Terrible things were done to us by them, and we're all us. You know, even if you happen to have held quite a high position, but that sense of it was all done by us to them is very strong, and I think our connection with in the post-Soviet times, we have probably more connection than we did before with Russian opinion.
Absolutely.
So there's probably something in that. But there probably is simply that, as you say, that people like history to be a morality play. Now that, I always was very strongly against that. I came in with very much the feeling history shouldn't be a moral. That's not what a historian is meant to be doing, making moral judgments. I had that stronger than I would now have it, but it was just absolutely straightforward to me that the historian's duty was to be as detached and as objective as possible. That's the way I saw it in the 70s.
Well, I certainly look forward to seeing your next book, which I understand is on Stalin and his inner circle.
His team, yeah.
So we shall do our best to address the broader public and bring them away from.
Now that is addressing the broader public. Yeah.
Can you tell us something about your training in history from Melbourne and how you came to do your PhD in England?
Yeah, well, I actually come from a family of historians, which meant that I didn't mean to be a historian. I at university level, I sort of aimed myself in various different directions. First of all, music, and then English. But somehow I ended up in history, and the reason I ended up in history was that we had a fourth-year honours essay to do on the basis of original research, and Russian was a language I'd taken, and so I thought, okay, I'll try and do it on a Russian subject. And that subject was Soviet music. And it was a question, they say they want to make art accessible to the people. And have they actually done this, succeeded in doing this in any way? So I found the process of researching that and thinking about it absolutely fascinating. So I was totally hooked on that, on the business of, to me, doing history and reading history are incredibly different activities. And it was the doing that I really liked. So then, as was always the case pretty well in Australia at that point, in beginning 60s, they always sent their people off to preferably to Oxford or Cambridge to get finished. So off I go, full of having received a very good and rigorous education in Melbourne, which emphasised primary sources and objectivity, and it was a very strong message that one got there. So I go off to Oxford with these, probably rather priggishly, with all this sense of what it means to be a historian, and thinking I'm going to, there isn't really a history of the Soviet Union yet written, so I'm going to start writing it. And I sort of assumed that at Oxford I would learn. That I would learn. I assumed that what I got in Melbourne was a much lower level than what I would get at Oxford. That turned out to be disappointing, because really, who knows why? But in any case, so what I acquired at Oxford was what I did at Oxford. Since you didn't actually get taught anything, I read the work on Sovietology, mainly American. And I thought it was, at that time, very critical, and thought it was pretty awful, because I thought it's all politicized. They're not really trying to use a range of sources. There are many sources. They're not, okay, it's hard to get sources, but you don't have to use only Pravda and Stalin's collected works. There is some other stuff out there. And so that's what happened to me in Oxford that kept me on in the field, keenly interested, but already with a slightly challenging attitude towards the existing scholarship.
And then when you expressed an interest in working in the Commissariat of Enlightenment and working in Russian archives, what was the response of your advisors at Oxford?
Well, my advisor was a literary man. He was a translator. He was always terribly puzzled by the fact I kept talking about sources and so on. Well, he thought fine, whatever she's talking about, let her go off and do it. And so there was no sense of criticism of doing it. I think people were quite interested in Lunacharsky and, interested in what I'd find out about him.
So, right. Do tell us about the experience of working in the archives in the late 1960s.
Right. Well, this leads on from the Oxford story, really, because once I'd got to Oxford and found that actually there wasn't, as I saw it, a great deal for me to learn there, I became extremely keen on getting myself to the Soviet Union and getting hold of whatever materials I could get there. That was quite difficult for all sorts of reasons, because Australia had no official exchange and so on. So finally I get myself there. It took me about 2 years. And once I'm there, I think, well, I need to get access to archives. I'm working on this ministry, this commissariat, so I need access to archives. And I think there was a strong degree of innocence in this. I didn't realize that on the Soviet period you didn't get access to archives, because I hadn't mixed with, Oxford didn't have historians who tried to do this, so I just didn't know it. And I was very convinced of the rightness of my cause, and so on. So I went around explaining to archive directors that I really need access. And after a while, I think, and there's the famous, this ends with the famous scene, which I suppose I've turned it into a story now, where I go to the archive director in Garth, this was the former Garth, and say, well, I can't do this story without this. And he said, no, and I was so frustrated, I started to cry. And he, at this point, which I was very embarrassed by, but he then pats me on the shoulder, more or less, and in the way Soviets sometimes do, decided, okay, the young girl, doesn't matter what she writes. So he picks up the telephone and he says, you could give her some archives. And anyway, so that was my great triumph.
The beginning of a great career.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.